Leo Childs, who's also known as Skip Childs, was working at his father-in-law's Getty gas station in the summer of 1974 when word came in that a woman's body had been found in the dunes in Provincetown. Now, 45 years later, Skip has a part-time job mowing the church cemetery where the Lady of the Dunes is buried. In this 45th year after her body was found, the victim, known now as the Lady of the Dunes, has not yet been identified. This is a podcast by the Cape Cod Times about the Lady of the Dunes case and other unidentified bodies, skeletal parts, and unsolved homicides in our region. I'm Mary Ann Bragg, one of the reporters, and with me today in the studio is Skip Childs and his wife Margie Childs, who both live in Truro. Tell us all about your ties to Provincetown from around in the 1970s, in terms of where you were, how old you were, what you were doing at about that time.
I grew up in Provincetown in the mid-70s when the Lady in the Dunes was discovered. We were just about ready to move back to Provincetown. Skip had gotten out of the service. My parents were still living in Provincetown. And I think my mom probably called me and said, oh my goodness, they found a body in the dunes. And then shortly after that, when we came back to Provincetown, it was the talk of the town.
How about you, Skip?
Well, at that time, I was a mechanic by trade. And I had a job offer to go to work at Rod Service Station on Conwell Street. And then we did come back to Provincetown, and that's where I went to work.
So tell me about as you remember it, on July 26, 1974, when they did announce that they'd found the Lady of the Dunes.
Well, still, in my memory, we weren't in town at that point. We frequented town quite often, so any conversation that we heard might have been on the weekends around town or something of that nature, but we hadn't actually moved back full-time to town.
And when you said there was something about your father-in-law's filling station, or?
Well, in those days there were various workshops around town, a lot of different places. Garages were one of them, and they were gathering places for people to stop in and talk, and you got the daily news. The guys that came into the garage first thing in the morning would be able to tell you, if there was a fire last night, or if somebody's boat sunk at the wharf, or if there was a rescue squad call. So you knew what the community was doing all the time. So it was a gathering spot, and we had groups of guys that would come in and stop in the morning just to say hello, or they'd gas up their pickups before they went to work or something of that nature. And you got a lot of local information that way. It was a different time. There was no internet, and there was no social media at that time. So the telephones still had rotary dials on them. So it was a lot of interaction amongst the people in the town to communicate what the local news was.
And so that particular day, do you remember being at, you said was it a Getty's? Your father-in-law's, or Margie's dad's?
Right, it was a Getty station. I don't know if I was even around on that particular day of the incident. However, there were numerous conversations from time to time. The people came in, and I don't know what precipitated the conversation, but the conversation would come up, and they would have a discussion or a little town hall meeting, like to just kind of talk about things that were discovered, or what they found incredible about the whole situation.
Right.
So it went on from time to time.
Margie, tell me about you the police chief at the time, Chief Meads. What was talk to us a little bit about how involved he was or committed to the case.
So I think that, like when Skip was talking about the whole town meeting feel of how things progressed in Provincetown, there wasn't the level of secrecy, I think, in the police department. They were so it was difficult to solve. And I think they knew it was going to be a difficult case to solve. So I think they tried to get as much information out as they could. Where today, immediately, the district attorney, and they would close everything down. The state police were involved, as well as the Provincetown police. And the Provincetown police, it was all people we grew up with, that we knew. So at the time, Jimmy Meads, so you had Jimmy Meads, the fire chief, and Jimmy Meads, the police chief. And Jimmy Meads, the police chief, I think, really either felt very badly that this woman had died basically alone, just with her assailant in the dunes. The fact that the body was mutilated, that her hands were cut off. And I really felt like, because we knew him, it became his life's work to try to solve the case. At the time, the police officers that were working in Provincetown, I think it became very important to them to solve the case. And, I remember reading about when they brought in forensic scientists to recreate this woman's face. Mm-hmm. Those were things we had never heard of. And yet, Jimmy Meads really pulled out all of the stops to try to get enough information to identify this woman. And then I do think that he was probably instrumental in getting her buried at St. Peter's Cemetery. She had no resting place. There was no family that they knew of because they never identified her. So I think for him, it did become very, very personal. And as time went on, when he finally retired from the police department, I think it was probably the one thing that he regretted the most, that he was never able to solve the crime and who murdered her.
Right. I know that each police chief since then, each has picked up that case and attempted to make some progress on it.
Right.
You mentioned the cemetery. Was it a few weeks ago, I think? I was riding my bike by the cemetery. I saw a person mowing the lawn. This is at the St. Peter's Church Cemetery. I stopped, and then that's when I realized Skip introduced himself as the person mowing the lawn. So that's how we got started and ended up that you all are here today. But maybe talk to me about, either of you, in terms of how you think that her body ended up being buried there. I know, just maybe theoretically, or any information you might have in terms of how it is she came to be there.
I really don't know how she came to be there. It's kind of a remote spot in the cemetery. It might have been just an available piece of ground. And, like Margie said, I'm sure that Chief Meads felt very badly for the woman. And he may have been instrumental in securing a little piece of ground for her to rest in. You'd have to look for it to find it. There's nothing prominent there, even though she is probably one of the celebrities in the cemetery. As I said earlier, I was surprised to see that she was there, and it wasn't until I was trimming the grass around her stone that I realized that that's who it was.
I knew she was there, but so this, growing up in Provincetown with predominantly Portuguese people, so the cemetery had it was a huge focus and center of the family. when we were growing up, every Sunday, we would go to church, and then you went to the cemetery to visit the relatives, came home, changed out of your church clothes, and then went to Sunday dinner at my grandparents'. So the cemetery always had a focal point. So I knew she was there probably long before Skip did, just because of, it seemed like we were always in the cemetery, which seems a little crazy. But so I really do think that, Jimmy Meads was a prominent member of St. Peter's Catholic Church, and, really a generous soul. And I think that he probably was instrumental either through the Knights of Columbus or, there wasn't a quote-unquote Potter's Field. So I'm sure that she needed a resting place. And my guess would be that he was probably instrumental in securing that spot for her.
Maybe tell me a little bit about mowing the cemetery now and who asks about her, if anyone.
Well, I was asked to help the custodian from the church with the cemetery duties, and Father McCullough had bought a new mowing machine, and which makes a lot of noise, but he was very interested in having somebody that could maintain the machine because it was brand new and it was an expensive machine, and that's kind of how I got involved in helping out up there. I occasionally see people wandering around the cemetery looking at stones, and when I'm working around the cemetery, I look at the stones. It kind of keeps me occupied, see who's who, and a lot of the people that are there I knew. But we've probably had about like a dozen people or so that in the last 2 summers have asked, about where the Lady in the Dunes is, and it's pretty easy to point her out because of her remote location in the cemetery. So it's just down the end of the road, the last one on the left type of thing. And they go down and they take pictures of her headstone, and I've noticed that some people put seashells there or little mementos on the stone. I generally ask if they know who it is, and I've never got a positive response, but they are interested. So people come to Provincetown, and it's one of those things that they've heard the stories of the situation, and they're interested in it.
Margie, you mentioned that about that time, 1974, it was also just maybe a few months earlier that an infamous killer, I guess, had also died. So that there was, at the time in 1974, there was a bit of a kind of 2 famous things happening at one time. Would you just talk to me a little bit, or talk to us a little bit about that?
I remember at the time with, so when sitting having coffee in friends' kitchens or my parents, or a lot of people suspected that the previous killer, who was now in prison, had something to do with it. And maybe even to the level of Provincetown was such a sleepy, quiet little place where nothing really happened. Jimmy Meads, when he was a sergeant, had stopped me on Bradford Street and given me a written warning. So that was
for what?
For speeding.
Oh.
So that was, those were not a whole lot happened in Provincetown. It was very sleepy and it was very quiet. And so now, you had the first round of murders when I was a senior in high school.
This is Tony Costa.
That was Tony
right?
Costa.
In Truro.
Yep.
Okay.
And so, he was tried in Provincetown because the courthouse was in Provincetown then. It wasn't, your courthouse was right in your town, and was sent to jail. And then he, the story goes that he hanged himself in prison in 1974. So as soon as the lady in the dunes was found, people immediately thought, uh-oh, it's more of the crime spree of Tony Costa. And, I think that possibly that might have hindered the case, because I think people thought, oh, it's just more, drug-fueled crimes. I always marveled at the fact that, the reports were her extensive dental work, that nobody ever came forward. I also remember there was a connection with Canada that Jimmy Meads worked on for a long time. That they thought that she actually was not an American, that she was from somewhere else. But, it just... Provincetown was, in those days, had been very, very sleepy until, these two cases happened. And I think it changed the dynamic a little bit, especially as a native. You just never dreamed that those things would happen in sleepy little Provincetown.
And how do you feel about the case now? Yeah, both of you, either.
I'm amazed that it hasn't been solved, to be honest with you. With the level of forensics today, with DNA, if some of the players are now deceased, would somebody come forward? I know at one point there was conjecture that Whitey Bulger had something to do with it, because he frequented Provincetown in the late 60s and 70s. And, some of the methods that he used when his victims were murdered, extracting teeth and that kind of stuff. So that was like the latest round when the talk of the lady in the dunes resurfaced, when they linked it to Whitey Bulger, but I don't think that they ever got anywhere with that. It was just that sort of brought the case back to the forefront, though, I think. But I am very surprised that it's not solved. I wish it had been while Jimmy Meads was alive, because it had become so important to him. Wherever he is now, he probably knows who the murderer is. So,
Skip, how about you?
Well, I think that probably one of the largest topics of the conversation that went around the garage was the fact that there was no way to identify the woman, and people were not aware that it could happen, or that something could happen to you, and if they couldn't find your fingerprints, or they couldn't find dental records, or something of that nature, they wouldn't be able to tell who you were. And I think that was the most incredible thing that people came to realize, that in those days, it was way before DNA, and there was just no database. If somebody didn't know who you were, they just wouldn't be able to identify you. And I think that was probably the biggest thing. And like Margie said, it's with modern science having progressed as much as it has in the last 40-odd years, that something hasn't triggered who that person is, and so it's still pretty still a big mystery for the town.
So currently, the Cape and Islands District Attorney's office is using a technique called genetic genealogy to try to come up with her, at least her identity. So that means getting DNA from her remains, and then using that to combined with genealogy databases to maybe come up with a first cousin or some second cousins. So they're in the midst of doing that kind of analysis right now. But what do you think it would mean to the community for her identity to come to light?
I think it would mean a lot to Jimmy Meads' family, the children that still exist. As far as Provincetown goes, Provincetown has changed so much. So, the folks that were alive that it was very important to them that the case be solved, but so many of them now are gone. So I'm not sure how much community there is left in Provincetown that thinks about it, cares about it. I mean, obviously, our generation, we remember it, and it would be nice to finally see it solved, and that she wouldn't have, the notoriety / anonymity of being the lady in the dunes, that there would be a name and a history to go along with it. I think the toughest thing for Provincetown people, when Skip was talking about the fact that, the amazement that you would go somewhere, be killed, and nobody would know who you were. That was a difficult concept for Provincetown people because you knew everybody. You were related to everybody. And so the concept of being completely anonymous and having no way of anybody identifying you, I think that was something that really hit home with the Provincetown Portuguese community, because it was a very, very foreign concept.
Yeah, I think she's right. The demographics of the town have changed so much. We find it refreshing when we run across town people. So it seems like a lot of the old families are gone. Obviously, all the old fishing boats are gone. So it's a different thing. I think the majority of the population that live there now are just not aware of it, or just really not as close to it as people that were back then when it was all families and all working people in town. So I think it's a big change in the demographics. So I don't think it would have the same impact now as it would have had in 1980, we'll say. So I think it's, as time goes on, the people that were involved in it, the people that were concerned about it in 1974, that's all being washed out by attrition.
Thank you so much for visiting. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, it was kind of fun to talk about it.
Yep, we enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Brought back some old memories.
Listeners can find out more at capecodtimes.com/Lady of the Dunes. And a special thanks to Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com for the music for our show. Thank you for listening.